Muy bien, pues buenos días. Vamos a comenzar con esta primera sesión de la segunda jornada de esta Escuela Doctoral de Primavera. Ayer tuvimos un día bastante completo con intervenciones muy interesantes, como las de Amanda Paz-Alencar, la de Guillermo Orozco, etcétera. Y hoy tenemos pues la primera a la frente, ¿vale? Con una investigadora de gran altura. Yo agradezco enormemente a Ignacio Aguaded y a la Universidad de Huelva por invitarme a presentar a la doctora Abidin, que ya nos acompaña. Os adelanto, como os han comentado, pues que Cristal no habla español y por tanto su intervención va a ser en inglés. Me han pedido que haga una doble presentación, ¿vale? Entonces voy a presentar en primer lugar en español para vuestra comodidad, para que todos entendáis un poco quién es la persona que va a hablar con nosotros a continuación, y luego en inglés para que Cristal pueda entender la presentación y sepa pues las cosas tan feas que voy a decir sobre ella. Bueno, la doctora Cristal Abidin es docente e investigadora en la Curtin University de Australia, donde además lidera diversos proyectos relacionados con Internet y la cultura popular en las redes sociales. Además es investigadora asociada en la John Copin University de Suecia. Es antropóloga digital y etnógrafa de las culturas de Internet, las Internet Cultures. Sus investigaciones sobre la visibilidad online, sobre cultura popular en las redes sociales, sobre celebridad en Internet, etcétera, son pues, una referencia mundial. Entre sus publicaciones pues, podemos mencionar libros como Internet Celebrity, Understanding Fame Online, es decir, celebridad de Internet, entendiendo la fama online, en 2018, Micro Celebrity Around the Globe, es decir, microcelebridad en el mundo, en 2018, Instagram, Visual Social Media Cultures, es decir, Instagram, culturas visuales en las redes sociales, en 2020, y bueno, sus decenas de artículos académicos abordan cuestiones muy relevantes en la actualidad en relación con los selfies, la fama online, la profesión del influencer, etcétera, ¿no? Personalmente, os recomiendo encarecidamente sus publicaciones en las que podéis comprobar fácilmente que estamos ante una de las investigadoras pues, en comunicación más lúcidas y brillantes del panorama actual a escala mundial, ¿no? Como consecuencia de todo ello, apareció en 2018 en la lista Forbes de los 30 principales pensadores por debajo de los 30 años y en la lista Pacific Standard 30 Top Thinkers Under 30. Y siendo nombrada ABC Top 5 Humanities Fellow y ICA Popcom Early Career Prize en 2020. Creo que yo puedo seguir enrollándome fácilmente, pero no quiero robarle más tiempo y creo que con estas pocas pinceladas os podéis hacer una idea del enorme honor que sentimos de poder compartir este rato con ella y escuchar su conferencia titulada Internet, Celebrity and Social Media Pop Cultures, An Introduction to Digital Ethnographic Methods, es decir, celebridad en Internet y culturas populares en las redes sociales, una introducción a los métodos etnográficos digitales. Solo una última cosa y es la línea que os han planteado. ¿Vale? Que yo voy a estar pendiente de ese apartado de preguntas y respuestas, incluso lo estaré también del chat, por si alguno se despista. Os animo a ello, a que aprovechéis esa oportunidad de hacer preguntas directamente a una investigadora de este calibre. Y tomaré nota de todo para luego trasladársela. Es decir, que no esperéis al final, podéis ir haciendo preguntas durante todo el transcurso, yo las anotaré y así luego se las pueda formular a ella. Si os cuesta formularlas en inglés, ¿vale? Podéis formularlas perfectamente en español, ¿vale? Y yo luego me ocuparé de traducirlas lo mejor posible, en la medida de mis posibilidades, a la doctora Cristal Abidin, ¿vale? Por tanto, finaliza aquí la presentación en español y voy a contar lo mismo en inglés y comenzamos a continuación con la charla, ¿de acuerdo? Well, hello, Crystal. I'm going to start now again with the same presentation in introduction in English, okay?
Thank you.
So you can understand all the ugly things I'm going to say about you. Well, Dr. Crystal Abidin is Associate Professor at Curtin University in Australia, where she also leads several projects related on Internet studies and social media pop cultures. She's also affiliated researcher at John Copin University in Sweden, and she's a digital anthropologist and ethnographer of digital cultures. Her research on online visibility, on social media, pop cultures, on internet celebrity, etc., are a global point of reference. Among her publications, we can mention books such as Internet Celebrity, Understanding Fame Online from 2018, Micro Celebrity Around the Globe from 2018, Instagram, Visual Social Media Cultures from 2020, etc. And her dozens of academic papers address very relevant and current issues in relation to selfies, to fame online, to the profession of influencers, etc. Personally, I highly recommend her publications, in which you will be able to easily verify that we are dealing with one of the most insightful and brilliant communication researchers on a global scale at this moment. As a result of this, she appeared in the 2018 on the Forbes list of the top 30 thinkers under 30 years. Old, and on the Pacific Standard 30 top thinkers under 30 list on 2016, and was also named ABC Top 5 Humanities Fellow and ICA Popcom Early Career Prize, both in 2020. I think I could go on and on with this introduction, but I don't want to take up Crystal time, and I think you can get an idea of the enormous honor we feel to be able to share this time with her and listen to her lecture entitled Internet Celebrity and Social Media Pop Cultures, an Introduction to Digital Ethnographic Methods. And just one last thing, I read it again also in English, and that is that you can ask questions through the question and answers icon during the whole conference. So, and I, of course, encourage you to do so, to take this opportunity to ask directly questions to Crystal. I'll be checking this part of the web to write down all the questions. So then I will be able to ask them to Crystal at the end of her speech. If it's difficult for you to express your questions in English, you can ask them in Spanish, and I will manage to translate them the best I can for Crystal. So let's hear Dr. Crystal Abidin. You can stand, you can start whenever you wish, and thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professors David and Jose, and as well as Arantxa for this privilege to speak to you. I think it's so wonderful to have this opportunity to have this small group of very hardworking experts work through all the translations. I personally work in the Asia Pacific region, and it takes me a lot of effort to learn a new language every time I start new field work. So I really want to applaud this very invaluable work we're doing now across the globe. So hello from Australia. Thank you for having me. I would like to talk you through an introduction to digital ethnographic methods through my research on internet celebrity and social media pop cultures. I want to give you a heads up that I can speak very fast, especially when I'm excited and happy, and I love my research. So if there's anything you're not clear about, or if there are any further resources you would like me to point you to so that you can do some reading, I very welcome all of these questions either here or on Twitter. So without further ado, let's go. I'm going to be covering 6 main things today. In our outline, I want to first show you some snippets of my research. What do I do as an anthropologist of internet cultures who also has training in media communications as well as sociology? Then I want to get into the meat of today, some of the basics of digital ethnography, some recommendations for reading digital ethnographies, and the different types of online ethnographies that we can look into, how we can do ethnographic research in practice when we're actually implementing something, how I usually kick off a project, just to give you an idea of how you might want to frame what you should be looking for when you want to start something. And then finally, my favorite part is to bring you through a rabbit hole to see some of the research methods that I have used in the last decade or so. So thank you for bearing with me, and here goes. So if you would like any further readings that I'm going to be covering in the various research that I do, you're more than welcome to check them out on my website, wishchris.com, where you can find research projects, academic publications. There's also a glossary of key ideas and concepts and some multimedia. Thanks to a few opportunities of late, you will be able to find a couple of new snippets translated into Spanish under the multimedia and the press section. But what do I do? So I think most people might know me from my research on influencer cultures, but I like to say that I research internet visibility at large. And a very big part of internet visibility, a very big part of influencer cultures, is social media pop cultures. We can understand how the trends that influencers start, as well as the trends on various platforms, can really impact society today. So let me give you a few examples of the research that I've been doing. In these 2 pictures on the left, you see instances of Instagrammability. What passes the test to be considered Instagrammable today? When you go to a cafe, when you go to a landmark for a holiday, when people even visit dedicated photo studios like this just to take Instagram photos? What happens when Instagram changes its features and when it added the boomerang app? When it added the choice for you to do short video clips in your posts? Many of the cafes in my study ended up changing their menus so that the patrons that came would be invited to order dishes that would be boomerangable or Instagrammable. So there was flow now in addition to just a static Instagram image. Now, in the time of COVID-19, the power of influencers to spread messages and to sustain businesses cannot be further underscored even more. But prior to this, I have been looking at other platforms that are more popular in the Asia Pacific region, like this live streaming and messaging and video platform Be Live, and how some Instagrammers and influencers are using Insta Stories in order to pot and encourage people to go and try out a new app altogether. So lots of this has intersections to do with commerce, advertising, and live streaming cultures, not only in the very traditional platforms like Twitch and YouTube, but also innovative platforms on mobile and those that are more popular in my part of the world. In some of my other research looking at social media pop cultures, I have been studying platform-specific trends. So for example, on Tumblr, there is a very common phenomenon of astroturfing. People on Tumblr don't really have the habit of putting their actual names and faces on that platform. Most people communicate via avatars or their Tumblr block names. But for this reason, when you want to market something to people on Tumblr, it's really hard to try and pick out their demographic. Tumblr is also a space where there's a lot of humor. So when advertisers want to push for commercial messages there, they tend to incorporating a lot of meme marketing and astroturfing to make their commercial products and services sound as natural as possible. Most recently, I have a book on TikTok coming out next year, which I'm very excited about. And one of the key things I've been looking at special to that platform is social justice cultures and peer callouts. This involves groups of young people, especially Gen Z, who are aware that to go viral on TikTok, to be noticed by people, you really have to engage in political issues or social and cultural issues, whether this be very small identity politics or large-scale macro political issues. And for this reason, visibility on this space, pop culture in this space, can sometimes be a bit fraught because people are playing with the potential to be politically active, sometimes without really having any of that knowledge or that desire themselves. So these are very specific social media pop cultures that exist on different platforms, different commercial cultures, as well as bleeds into everyday life. Now, before I talk to you about internet celebrities and social media pop cultures as an example for how to do digital ethnography, I probably should tell you what internet celebrities are. I reckon that most people understand what influencers are, but even here living in Australia, depending on our age group, our cultural origin, what platform we use, we all have very different understandings of who we are talking about or who we are imagining when we say influencer or internet celebrity. So let me start us out with a baseline. Internet celebrity is a big, broad umbrella for us to understand influencers, which is a small subset. Now, internet celebrities have three main criteria, and I have underlined this in the quote. They are native to the internet, and that means they originate on the internet or social media. This makes them very different from mainstream celebrities like politicians or singers or actors who also have social media accounts. These are everyday, ordinary people, peasants like you and I who are native to the internet and then who gain popularity there. Criteria number 2, internet celebrities should primarily be measured for their high visibility. It doesn't matter whether or not they're popular or famous or well-liked. On the internet, visibility can be attributed to many things, but they have to be visible to both the machine eye, So the algorithms and the platforms registering them and promoting them to us in our feeds, and also visible to the human eye. So they have to catch my attention for me to want to watch them, follow them, or even listen to their content. The third criteria is that internet celebrities must have an audience. So supposing if you are someone who has put in a lot of effort and production value into a video, but no one watches it, that doesn't make you an internet celebrity. It has to be audience, it has to be acknowledged, and therefore a celebrity is a status that is birthed out of some sort of relationship of acknowledgement. I wanted to take us back to the orange portions. This is what will help us understand a little bit more about influencers. Earlier on, I said that internet celebrities are primarily measured by their high visibility, but the quality, the morality, the tonality of this high visibility can be quite malleable. It's quite flexible. And we can think of this as coming in moral pairs. So someone can be very highly visible on the internet because of fame or infamy, because of positive or negative attention, because they have a talent or a skill or none, whether it's sustained and long-term or whether it's transient, whether they did it intentionally with an agenda or happenstance by accident, and whether they monetize it or not. Internet celebrities can come in any permutation and combination of these. Influencers, though, we think of them as professional internet celebrities. This is their jobs. This is their careers. They're making a living out of this. So because of this, most influencers tend to lean towards the first quality of the attention pair, going for fame, positive attention, talent and skill, sustained, intentional, and monetized. I say most influencers because in this day and age where the industry is so saturated, you occasionally will see influencers that try and upset the status quo by
Dr. Abidin, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the part where you mentioned this very specific part where you talk about the main two parts that influencers follow, this pair? Just that slowly, because that's very important.
Sure. So if we look at this phrase in orange, the influencers tend to go by the first one. So they take on the more positive aspects of these qualities. The reason being this helps them make sure they're sustained and that they can make a monetized career out of this. But I say that this is most of the time because these days, when the industry is so saturated, we can see influencers trying to disrupt the status quo, trying to be different from the rest by doing the opposite. They might be just really outrageous, really shameless, always partaking in all sorts of scandals. And after attracting people, after you forget all that bad publicity, they may continue with this visibility on their route to becoming influencers. So this orange part, I should say, is becoming more and more flexible, even though traditionally influencers tend to go by the first of each of these pairs. Now let's go back to internet celebrity as a broader concept. Most of the time, when we think about internet celebrity, if I were to distill both their traditional research on this, as well as the current trends, there are generally four main qualities of internet celebrity, and each of them is linked to a type of capital in the vein of Purdue. So for instance, some internet celebrities, we are very attracted to them because of exclusivity. And this is linked to economic capital. They're a little bit more like traditional celebrities where they're showcasing a very elite lifestyle, for example, on Instagram, and people just want to find out more and more about them. So this is quite basic. The second quality of internet celebrity is everydayness, and this is linked to Bourdieu's notion of social capital. In this one, these internet celebrities make the effort to grow a relationship with their followers, usually posting very regularly, usually exchanging some sort of validation among their followers, or in trying to introduce some sort of emotive feeling that people can relate to. Everydayness can be found in all sorts of platforms, but most of the time, we find them in platforms where people post very regularly, and you can see that comparison of posting regularly. By this, I mean an Instagram feed, where you can scroll through very quickly and see all the different pictures of some baby cosplaying during nap time, or maybe YouTube videos as you follow people across the many, many months to see their daily lives. There is a third quality of internet celebrity, and that is exceptionalism. This is linked to the quality of technical capital. Now, technical capital is not one of the traditional capitals from Purdue, but it's been drawn from scholars who study in STS and education to highlight the fact that some people have expert skills and knowledge in something, a machine, a language, for us maybe Zoom or knowing how to use webcams. And this demonstrates a type of social mobility for them. For internet celebrities, this exceptionalism can also go down to very weird and strange and mundane expert skills. So the traditional ones might be a musician who is a very young child and exceptionally gifted. But sometimes the internet's a bit weird and quirky. It can also be because a very talented young woman in China knows how to cook food on her office table using the most crazy of everyday appliances. So using a hairdryer and a coffee pot to make a pancake. Last but not least, we have the quality of exoticism. Exoticism is linked to the notion of cultural capital. And this is where we are excited and introduced to something that we may not even understand at all. We look at these things and we're so encapsulated and captivated by them because we feel so distant from them. They're so contrasting from what we understand. And it highlights really the intersectionality of all these different bodies on the internet. On the Asia Pacific spaces where I look, unfortunately, a lot of East Asian women often go viral in North American circles because of Orientalism. Something that may be very common, like mukbang or binge eating, or these parody dancing with food and humor, is actually really, really common in East Asia. But when you displace this out of its home and it's viewed by an audience in a completely different cultural setting, all of a sudden these people have internet celebrity. People want to watch them. To give you another example and some newer research I'm doing, think about the idea of white presenting foreigners who can speak Asian languages fluently. We always see this on TikTok, or vice versa. Asian presenting people who maybe unexpectedly speak European languages very fluently, and people just want to know what is it about them that has this quality, and therefore they attract people for that cultural mismatch in that space and time. So these are the 4 big qualities of internet celebrity that attract us to them. And naturally, these are the 4 qualities that many internet celebrities who become influencers also use. They are not exclusive, so you can always mix and match. Sometimes they start off with one and move on to the other. Sometimes it flips depending on your life course. All this is just to say these are the big brackets, but there are certainly many, many other reasons why we are so attracted to internet celebrities online. Now that we have a basic understanding of internet celebrities as well as social media pop cultures, I want to talk us through the basics of digital ethnography. You will realize that I've put digital in brackets because as someone who was trained in anthropology, it would probably do the discipline a disservice if I didn't go through some of the more traditional canon. Ethnography was originally a disciplinary method that was most used by anthropologists, but in contemporary research, it is now a methodology that's used by people in many various disciplines. So I'm going to draw from a variety of sources here, including media and communication studies, to talk through some of the key principles as well as key ideas that we need to understand in digital ethnography. So this is the first cheat sheet, so to speak. I have put here in very quick and brief main points what I think are the main principles and issues we need to consider. First of all, for many of us who may not be very familiar with anthropology, there are generally 4 to 5 branches that I've listed here on top. And digital ethnography or ethnography traditionally permeates through all of these branches but we often see it most applied in the social cultural, because this is where we really study very closely human society, human cultures, and groups of people and their behaviors. Ethnography basically means a systematic study of human cultures. But what are human cultures? If you were asking me as a student maybe 40, 50 years ago, all the books we read were about rituals and customs and mores and practices. To give you an example, when I was writing up a chapter of my PhD years ago, looking at how young women were doing online shaming online and being very scandalous, in my research looking into ethnography and shame, I ended up needing to read about placenta burial rituals in all these far-flung villages and rural areas where they had a lot of norms over women's bodies and what you can do when they're having their period, when they're giving birth, when they've committed some sort of impasse in that space. But these very same rituals, customs, mores, and practices can also map into our contemporary social media landscape. For example, if someone mentions you, it may not be polite if you just ignore them. If someone congratulates you for something, it's probably polite if you at least like it and acknowledge it. So there are all these tacit rules and rituals also governing how we perform our human cultures on social media. And that helps us map all these traditional tools and learnings to a digital space. So here are the 5 basic principles. The first main principle that is super important in any ethnography is cultural relativism. What this means is that we all have different cultural beliefs and standings and standpoints. And if you want to understand a culture specifically, you need to be able to expend some effort to remove yourself from your own background and understand where people are coming from in their shoes. This requires you to suspend some of your own belief, maybe withhold some of your own judgment in order to see where other people are coming from embedded in their own social cultural rules. So if we do this well, we can avoid ethnocentrism, which is when we tend to judge other people by our own values and cultures, and we can also avoid pitfalls like Orientalism. The second principle is the insider-outsider doctrine. What this briefly means is that we understand human cultures exist in different spaces and contain many different groups of people. As someone who's doing the study, you can be an insider who is within the group and has a lot of native knowledge, or you can be an outsider who is coming in wanting to study what this culture and what this group does. Both viewpoints are valid. Both viewpoints are different. But any good anthropologist or ethnographer will be able to bridge between the two. What this really takes us to is a theory called standpoint theory. In brief, it tells us that wherever you are standing, in say a circle, in a society, in a public space, that informs what you're looking at, and that informs your perspective in life. To give you an example, if you work in a university, if you're an undergraduate student versus a janitor versus the vice chancellor versus someone who works in IT, you are all going to have very different perspectives on university life. If a crisis hits the university, it will probably impact you differently as well because of where you're standing in this space. So in this case, it is very important for us to acknowledge intersectionality. This is a concept coined by a Black feminist scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, who wants to highlight that there is a compiling and there is an amplified add-on effect whenever we think of our different demographics like race, gender, religiosity, sexuality, so on and so forth. At the same time, sometimes when we have a different combination of these demographics, we experience maybe oppression or harm that cannot really be attributed to any single thing. So let's go back to the example I gave you about these young women from Asia who were doing mukbang eating or dancing with fish. When people send them hate comments online, it is not always easy for us to say, oh, this is sexist, or this one is racist, or this is just a person being ignorant, because oftentimes their intersectional demographics makes it such that as Asian women on the internet space, they're open to multiple vulnerabilities and multiple attacks from all parts. So I don't want us to think of this as a competition. You know, the more intersectionality you have, the worse your life is going to be. It is important for us to understand both the multiplied effects as well as the combinations of effects that make the oppression or the privilege very exclusive to this group. The third principle is cross-culturalism. Now, oftentimes when you do ethnography, you have this really, really fun, exciting privilege to go very deep into a culture. But as much as you go very deep into something, you need to be able to emerge from your study to give some relevance to the world. Like, why would I care if your research tells me something specific to one age group, of one gender, of one race, of one neighborhood, only in one time? Can it be mapped into any other parts of the world or any other time periods? What lessons can this give us about society? So there has to be an element of comparison, and some of your learnings and your teachings should ideally have some cultural universals that we can take and broaden out and understand as being symptomatic of society. Fourthly, this is maybe the one that's most difficult to train, but requires a lot of practice. This is reflexivity. The fact that you're always constantly thinking about your own social position as a researcher. So as an anthropologist and an ethnographer, a lot of the data that I have and collect requires me to persuade it out of my informants. The way I present myself when I interview them, the way I behave when I go and do research, means that they will respond to me differently and tell me different stories. So for example, you will later on see in one of the works I recommend by Margaret Mead, if a young person of color who is a woman sits with young women and asks about their lives, you're probably going to get quite a good sense of their genuine stories. But if you throw like an old white man researcher with the same group of young women, they're probably not going to be able to divulge the same stories to him because of his own demographic and how they feel towards him. So we need to constantly remember to be reflexive about where we are. We need to remember that as researchers, we all have our own habitus that impacts what we think is culturally relative, what is the insider and outsider, and that all realities are really socially constructed. Nothing really is standard, nothing is a staple. A lot of things need to be negotiated back and forth. With my current research in influencers, because of the time period I've spent and the hundreds of people I've interviewed, it is possible for me to make any argument, influencers being vain, not vain, earning money, not earning money, powerful, not powerful. But how is this relevant to the research? How can I construct their social reality by investigating what is special about their demographics, about the time period in which I studied them, about the research questions and whether or not they're more relevant to some people over others? And by this, we have to triangulate the truths that we are making. The fifth principle of ethnography is that we go by inductive reasoning. Generally, we start with an observation, develop a pattern, a hypothesis, and a theory. It's quite different from our friends in hard sciences who maybe start with a hypothesis and then try and test things out, which makes it a little bit tricky because in order to start at this observation period, you will need to do some preparation to make sure that you're looking for the right things or things that are useful for your scholarship. That is something I'll talk about in one of the sections on kicking off our project. Now, let's go on to methods. Ethnography actually isn't a method. Even though we say things like, I do ethnography, this is an ethnographic work. Ethnography, as I've said before, it is a systematic study of human cultures. And there are many different methods that we can use. Most of the time when people say they do ethnography, it might be a combination of these methods. I'm going to highlight just 5, but please understand that as we're evolving, there are definitely a lot more methods coming up. The most traditional method of ethnography is participant observation. It is really good for us to study intimate relationships. It can be emic or overt or covert, depending on how you want to present yourself to your participants. There is also non-participant observation, where you're kind of doing a close-up documentary. It's ethic. You're like a fly on the wall and you're just watching people without wanting them to know you are there. because you're concerned that once you introduce yourself, there might be some behavior modification. The third one is personal narratives, and this is one of my favorites because it often allows us to open dialogue, and I discover a lot of things that I never thought of before, that I didn't put into my interview schedule, that I didn't think were really relevant. One of the most important questions you can ever ask in an interview is there anything I haven't talked about that you want me to know? Or is there anything interesting about your life or this topic that you feel I should learn more about? And oftentimes your informants will show you a whole brand new world or a rabbit hole that perhaps we were not even focused on. This can take the form of interviews, studying biographies, or focus groups. Fourthly, there's also audio-visual solicitation. This is quite fun because it involves a level of co-production or soliciting contents from your informants where you create, collect, and collate material together. A very popular example are researchers who give cameras to their participants and ask them to take pictures of where you live on the street or your daily life, or write a diary, or check into an app as you go about your day so I can figure out how you're feeling. Last but not least, we have contextual and supplementary research that relies on archival research, surveys, and the content analysis of secondary data. With these 5 methods in mind, I want to highlight 3 things that I've already mentioned throughout, but I think are crucial for us to remember. We can often do multi-sided ethnography. It doesn't only have to be one space, and you can take effort to define a field. Later on, I'll talk you through how we can do some field defining by showing you an example of mine. It is important for us to triangulate, to combine methodologies, to get various sources, various perspectives. If you're wanting to find out how the university is doing, you shouldn't be interviewing, only the tenured big name professors. You want to interview the smaller people who are struggling, those who are precarious, those who are on the boundaries and the fringes, and these various perspectives give you a more coherent picture. Lastly, this is maybe the most important out of everything, field notes. Your field notes are not just the notes you take when people tell you things or when you observe things. Your field notes are also your own diary keeping for yourself, where you pay attention to the process of how you're doing this study. For example, if I'm looking through maybe a Reddit thread, my field notes diary will say whether or not I'm doing it on my phone or on the desktop, because the interfaces are different, right? And the time that I spend doing them might be different. The posts that are showed to me might be different. I will also make field notes such as, how did I get into this thread today? Am I doing this in the morning or in the evening? How am I feeling as I'm doing this? Am I continuing it through something else, or am I just exploring something new today? So writing these meta commentaries of your state as a researcher, as part of your field work, is very important for you to understand the social construction process of data that you collect from ethnography. Now, chances are after this lecture, you're going to Google into Google Scholar digital ethnography. Chances are you're going to get a heart attack because you're probably going to see many keywords that look very similar. And here I give you a snapshot of many different types of methodologies that seem similar to digital ethnography. It's not to say that these are completely different, but they're not completely overlapped either. Every one of these comes with a very different legacy or baggage. Case in point, I'm aware from some of my collaborators in Spain that ethnography is a very popular substitute for digital ethnography. And this is likely because we need to think about the disciplinary origins. Ethnography was one of the earliest methods or coined, but it was primarily for research to do with, say, online marketing. And as the field of business and social media research is very large in the European parts of the world, most people tend to use this method. Something like virtual anthropology, if you were to search these resources, actually have 2 very different methods. For some of them, virtual anthropology is rooted in archaeology, like Indiana Jones. And the virtual here is when they get artifacts and they scan them in 3D and use technologies to study things. For some other people, virtual anthropology means going into a virtual world, like Second Life or Minecraft, and you immerse yourself in this space. So all of these different words come from different legacies to do with disciplines, countries, languages, and the reality is we need to remember that academics and academia is also a political space. People like to coin new things every now and then. So if you're encountering this in your research, don't panic. Just understand that all of these are interconnected. Find the one that works best for you. On to section 3. This section I will go through very quickly. Usually at the end of lectures, your lecturers give you one slide with a lot of words going, reading recommendations. I have always been one of those students who never really bothered with that slide. So I'm going to insert this into the middle of my lecture to highly recommend some resources for you to look into. I'm grouping these into 5 pairs, and each of them have a very different contribution if you're just starting out to do ethnography. So first, these 2 books are very traditional, very milestone works in doing ethnography. I need to give this caveat that because of their tradition, they tended to be ethnographies written by people of privilege from the global north, white bodies going to rural areas and writing about those cultures. This is not to say that the research is not valid, but I want us to situate how we are always constantly constructing knowledge and evolving from this. So in the 1920s, these 2 books were 2 different anthropologists and how they were tracking 2 different groups. And then we want to go on to 2 different other types where we have people who are sort of in the middle of being insiders and outsiders. Liza Dalby, an American who moved to Japan and actually became a geisha in her training in order to study their cultures. And Ramit Dasgupta, a mixed-race Japanese man who had lived outside of Japan for some time and then went back there to study how corporate culture is like in Japan. Because of their positionalities as in-between people going back and forth, you will see in their stories that their reflexivity is so beautiful. They're able to talk about how they're seeing this from being far away and being in the culture, which is really good liking. And I really, really want to recommend this book by Ramit in particular, who is a really dear friend of mine. Now we're getting to the more internet-y things. These are internet cultures of the late 90s and the early 2000s, looking at specific platforms. So for Laura Kendall, looking at a virtual pub, and for Tom Bostorff, looking at the platform Second Life. And these anthropologists literally hung out in these spaces, perform in their avatars to get to know people, scope out the world, do interviews. And it's very much a digital ethnography because the thing that they were studying was completely digital. And that was really nice and beautiful. Next, this is more with an intersection of social media and real life in the flesh, so to speak. We have a book looking at an ethnography of fashion blogging, which of course has a component of online blogs and photography, but requires this ethnographer to go out on the street to find these people, to photograph them, to study their photographic framing, to interview them, as well as a book on how digital activism and political change is happening both in a fleshy meat protest space as well as on social media. So you're seeing how there are 2 different types of online-offline convergences happening. Last but not least, these are 2 books I recently co-authored. Now, they are not strictly ethnographies. They are platform studies in which 3 different scholars of different disciplines were wanting to understand the main features of a platform. But in various chapters, there are definitely ethnographic approaches that were necessary in order to draw out the stories of the cultures on some of these platforms that could not otherwise have been studied if we only did content analysis or interviews. And I hope that will be useful for all of us. That has been my library list. I want to now talk us through how do we actually do ethnographic practice. Now, so much theory is great, Crystal, but how do we do this and not die from a headache? Well, thankfully for us, there are also handbooks, companions, and approaches that can guide us through. I want to stress that there are dozens of these, but if you're just starting out, these are 5 that I recommend for different reasons. The first one, Ethnography and Virtual Worlds, is a combination of 4 different scholars who have studied a very different virtual world in their approach. This second book requires us to think about ethnography for the internet in terms of the space, the text, the visuals, and all its different features. This third book has some principles and practices from a group of scholars who are doing innovative research between visuality, art, as well as ethnography, which is why you can see them highlight the visual a lot more. This really ginormous companion has several chapters from scholars from many different disciplines, and there are many case studies of how we have resulted or found out interesting case studies based on our different ethnographic methods. The most recent one is a collection by a whole group of very interdisciplinary scholars who are talking about how they feel about the internet in their research space. What metaphors do we use? But in so telling their stories, you get a sense of how these scholars have been conducting their research. And I take it like a very intimate and scholarly diary entry for how people have been able to overcome problems, issues, or uncover interesting research as the internet has evolved. You can also look at very specific special collections on thematic topics. For instance, both of these special issues from the Journal of Digital Social Research based in Sweden highlight different things. The first one here, looking at how scholars conceptualize what is the digital and the social, coming from different angles. And the second one that I had the pleasure of guest editing are confessions, failures, all the troubles and the pain and heartache from doing digital ethnography, and how we managed to recover from that. So if these are the types of research areas you're looking into, or if those are the struggles you have, go and look out for these types of special issues across various journals. Now, a bit of a more pragmatic bit of advice. This by far is one of the best guides I've encountered that I often share with a lot of my students as a cheat sheet for how to start. John Postel and Sarah Ping give us a suggestion for 6 things that you can follow if you're wanting to do digital ethnography. You can follow what is the viral reality. So what is happening now in the moment? How is it changing? You can follow the digital technologies, specific devices, platforms, and media. You can follow the technologists, that is the people or different groups of people who are doing this phenomena. You can follow the field as different topics and themes come about, or the subfields, or the genealogy, for instance, how things are arranged from one time period to another time period. I see a hand raised, so I'm going to stop for a couple of seconds to see if there is a question.
Well, there are actually some of them, but I don't know if you prefer to answer them at the end, or do you want me to read them now? What do you prefer?
If it's okay, maybe we'll finish sections 5 and 6, and then we can go into a Q&A.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Sounds good. Let's carry on. So let me give you an example of how I would usually kick off a project. This is the first step. If let's say I want to study influencers, before I go and observe, that was the first part of inductive reasoning, right? Before I do anything at all, I need to do background research. If I'm studying the influencer, is it enough to just look at the person? What is in the background, the back end, and the foreground? So this is one example of how I map all the different people involved in this industry, from the fans, haters, followers, sponsors, clients, agencies, managers, regulation bodies, governments, and platforms. And of course, there are so many more, but for the purposes of maybe this specific project, I have mapped it out in this way. And then now I need to figure out, what do I need to keep in mind when I want to answer my own research question? Can I just look at this influencer, or must I triangulate, extrapolate, find different perspectives to answer this question? Let me give you an example. When I did that project on influencers and online shame, I needed to look at the influencer, and I also needed to look at the platforms because they censor different things. And then I need to look at the haters, because usually what constitutes shame is when people react negatively to something. So that was my different perspective. When I was doing a project looking at how some influencers were being very naughty and not telling the public that they were doing commercial content, I needed to look at the regulation bodies, because these are the people who point these things out. the clients, who sometimes are the ones who tell influencers, don't tell people this is sponsored, as well as the fans. How are they responding when they find out that their influencers are not being transparent? So depending on my research question, I needed to find different perspectives, and that is something you can do for yourself as well. The next thing I did, of course, was to do my lit review. This takes so much time, but it's really, really important. So this is an example of my lit review when I was doing a history of internet celebrity. I use internet celebrity as the bigger umbrella word rather than influencers, because if I search influencers, I got this really false sense of security that the research only started in 2008. And it's so little research, it's only a few thousand pieces, when really this connects to the larger research on celebrity at large. I then went to look at the more specific books, papers, collections that really targeted my research topic. So in the first one before here, I was looking at the concepts and the theories related to my project. Whereas this one here, I was looking at the content and the themes and other people's projects that are close to mine so that I can borrow from them. This is just one example of how I've broken down some of my lit review resources by grouping them into these 5 categories, by mapping them by the year so that I can check whether or not there's any evolution, by also noting the publisher, because this gives me an indication of whether it's an academic text, something for students, whether it's something that's maybe highly Americanized or something that pays more attention to a more global perspective. So these are details that are really important to me before I start reading the text, mapping out all the pools of knowledge, and then finding out what scholarship I want to draw from and build on. I cannot stress this part of your research enough, because as a peer reviewer who is marking essays, theses, and journal articles, it's so surprising the number of people who say, I'm researching influencers, this is new, it has never been studied, here is my new finding, when in reality, there's a lot of history and legacy behind the research. How do you identify a field site or a focus? Earlier on, when I had all those people on my map, that gave me very different arrows and trajectories to go out and to see a very big landscape. And then from here, I came up with a whole list of ways that I can group together how I want to study a specific phenomenon. Here, I give you only 6 examples, but in my initial process, there was something like 25 to 30 field sites for just one paper. So for instance, I could study an individual digital biography, only just one person's profile, and see how they've carried themselves out. This is very much like celebrity studies. I can study a network, a genealogy, a family tree to see how these influences are linked to each other. And this is about a combination of sociology and anthropology. I can look at interest person communities, so a fandom, a group of people on a forum, people who like a certain genre or practice. I can look at hashtag publics, how are people reacting to something on a comments thread, on a forum, using a hashtag. I can look at networks of practices, whether on screen, for example here, taking selfies with a lot of influencers, and then after that, speaking to them, asking them about how they're posing, why are their faces like that, why am I so close to the camera so that I always look like the potato, or the network of practices behind the scenes. What do influencers really, really do when they're making us content, behind the camera, posing in public, carrying around all these devices? So this was an example for myself, mapping out all the possibilities and then picking either one or a combination to answer my research question. Now, this is my favorite part. I'm going to go through this very quickly in about 3 to 5 minutes, just as an excuse to show you some of the ways I have been doing my research over the years. My very, very first project on influencer culture started in 2008, when as an undergraduate, I did a research module that allowed me to write an independent paper and do research. It was so fun. And at that time, I wanted to study why these groups of bloggers online were so popular for selling secondhand clothes, and how that eventually evolved to them starting businesses, meeting with young women who came to greet them, be their fans, collect clothing, them opening their shops, them doing their posing and their makeup and photo shoots. And I even went off to 3 other countries later on in my undergrad to study the distribution and how these bloggers were buying their items and their wares. The second different big milestone or shift in my research focuses on influencers. At least at that time, they became to be called influencers by about 2013. And I did a combination of online digital ethnography, attending these influencer award shows that are kind of like the Emmys or Oscars, but for social media influencers. I had the opportunity to shadow a group of managers and influencers as their personal assistant and got to follow them to events, take cute photos, but also see how they interact with fans along the way. My third major project took place when I moved to the Nordic countries. I was based in Sweden briefly, and I took that opportunity to also expand my research to Denmark, Finland, and Norway. Here, I focus more on influencer agencies and companies. So those who provide the platform or the structures for these influencers to be groomed. This is an example of some of the agencies, services, and platforms. And then my next project, when I moved back home here to Australia, turned my eye to the East Asian region when I wanted to find out how East Asian and Australian influencers were affecting culture in this space. Before COVID, I got to continue with my field work in these countries, visiting these Douyin or Chinese TikTokers making content, looking at how some influencers became GIFs or stickers, attending live streams, going to cafes that were specifically designed for influencers to come and create their contents. And then, yeah, more pictures of when I accidentally became a model on a live stream show because they were a shot of someone and my informant asked if I could help. And I said yes, without really truly knowing what I was in for. But it was quite a good experience to see how these more professional people were doing it. And getting to understand the behind the scenes of all the products and the event management. My latest project is a very large-scale meta project, mapping the governance of the influencer industry in the Asia-Pacific region, wanting to know what the standards and the best practices are. I'm now at stage 2 of the project, and as we evolve, hopefully over the years, I'll get to move to sections 3, 4, and 5 as well. So that's that. I want to also thank my 2 RAs, River Juno and Mr. Crow, who were providing those really beautiful sketches that you see. And thank you to Jose, David, and Arencia for what I hope will be a really good time of Q&A. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Crystal. It was a really insightful presentation, which has presented us a lot, an interesting overview of the digital ethnography and a lot of ideas for our research projects. I guess it will be really useful for our doctoral students who are starting to develop their research projects and the scope of the research. I will also like to remind our students that the video of this lecture will be available in a few days for them, so they can take notes regarding the bibliography, the references she gave, which are really interesting. We are a little bit out of time, but I guess we can manage to have at least 5 minutes to answer some questions, okay? So for example, Letty Queen, I don't think that's a real name, asks if you use, Crystal, any kind of application, I guess it's about software or whatever, to gather information of the online practices of these pop celebrities.
Yep. A combination of these. So for some of the projects, especially the most recent projects with my qualitative and quantitative collaborators, some of my collaborators have built specific scraping tools that are designed for us to collect posts on a large scale for something specific that we want to look at. But I need to stress that that's not strictly ethnography. That was a combination of various methods and disciplines where those collaborators of mine had the expertise to map out a very big phenomenon. And I went in as an anthropologist or ethnographer looking at a very specific thing. When I do my research though, I don't tend to go for scale when I follow people or when I collect data. And I actually spend more time deciding what to collect, who to follow very meaningfully. And most of the time this happens manually. To give you a metaphor, I like to think of ethnographers as like the Mars rover. You don't know anything about a planet, you're going to send this robot there to just discover and get a feel of what this space is like. And then when you have an overall landscape, maybe some things are very interesting to you, you will go and research that more in depth. But then after you've surveyed this landscape, you can give this to your friends in big data and quantitative studies who can then map out large scale things like frequencies, incidents. So as I'm growing in my research, I'm beginning to find it very useful to collaborate with people who do that approach as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Juan Muñoz asks in Spanish, I'll translate the question. He asks about the long-term consequences of this series of visibility behaviors on social networks in the birth of cultural and social models. I mean,
what is a model?
I think he's asking about how the practices of, for example, influencer culture, whatever, is somehow affecting to society. I guess that will be the more or less the meaning of the question.
Well, the straightforward answer is it's affecting almost every part of society. Yeah. I'm not just talking about, Instagrammability, addiction, and all those narratives. Think about the fact that these days, every politician is on social media. Every artist who has something to sell you is performing influencer logics. So while the people themselves are not strictly influencers by career, their online strategies are all from the influencer industry. Also, I think if we're remembering that we're now in the climate of misinformation, saturation, and fake news, we need to think about influencers as mediators. They are amplifiers of information, but they are also expert science communicators who can cut through all the white noise of the internet and give a target message to a target audience. The way they do that may be through humor or comedy or scandal or shame, but they can still get their message out there to the people whom they want to reach exactly.
Okay, I think maybe from Ignacio, I don't know if we have time for more questions. If because the next talk is about... ¿Tenemos un poquitito o solamente?
No, ya nos hemos pasado 5 minutos. Si queréis dar paso a alguna pregunta más, pues no hay problema, pero eso ya vamos corriendo un poco fuera de tiempo.
David.
Sí.
David. Sí, no nos deberíamos pasar mucho. Da paso a una pregunta más porque si no vamos a ir.
Cortamos, ¿no? Perfecto. Vale. Okay, we'll have just one last question. We have a lot of them in the chat, in the panel of question and answers, but we are running out of time. So we'll have just one last question. For example, Yihen Wang, who has asked 3 questions. We don't have time for all of them, I'm sorry, but maybe we'll have with the first one. She has, from the perspective of entertainment education, I'm like in health education or in risk communication, when we are facing with a crisis like this pandemic or whatever, how should we start our research with the focus of internet celebrities? I think it's a really complex question.
Yeah. You know how early on when I mapped out the influencer in the middle and all of these people? If you do that and you feel that this thing in the middle is influencers and COVID, then map out all the other people who is in this trajectory. The elderly who don't know social media jokes, very young people who believe these influencers wholesale, governments who are competing with influencers for attention, WHO, who is cooperating with influencers to get health messages out there. So I think depending on what your research question is, you can either see influencers in a positive or negative light, hopefully both, and then pinpoint your focus from there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Crystal Abidin. It was a pleasure and an honor to talk with you. I'm sorry we will not going to be able to answer all the questions.
It's all right.
There are a lot, but thank you very much. We're really pleased to have you.
Thanks for having me. All the best with the rest of the doctoral school, and I'll see all of you soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Y nada, para todos los demás, pues bueno, sabéis que a continuación, sin pausa, arranca la conferencia del doctor José López García de la Universidad de Santiago de Compostela. Muchas gracias.